The champagne flutes clinked softly above the murmur of Tampa's elite gathered at the Innisbrook Resort on a warm evening in April 1986. Robert Mazur stood in his tailored Armani suit, diamond Rolex catching the chandelier light, laughing at a joke told by a Colombian businessman whose cartel connections moved 2 tons of cocaine into the United States every month. To everyone in that gilded ballroom, Mazur was Bob Musella, a successful financial consultant who specialized in helping international clients navigate the complex world of American banking. His fiancée, Kathy, radiated charm beside him, her engagement ring worth more than most people earned in a year. What none of the drug traffickers, money brokers, or corrupt bankers surrounding him knew was that Bob Musella didn't exist, that Kathy was actually an undercover IRS agent named Kathy Ertz, and that every handshake, every business card exchanged, every whispered promise of discretion was building toward the largest money laundering takedown in U.S. history. Robert Mazur had joined U.S. Customs in 1975, drawn by a belief that financial crimes deserved the same aggressive pursuit as violent ones. He understood something fundamental that many law enforcement agencies were only beginning to grasp. Modern criminal organizations weren't defeated by street-level drug busts, but by attacking their financial infrastructure. The cartels could replace arrested dealers and smugglers within days, but disrupting their ability to transform drug profits into usable wealth struck at their operational core. By the mid-1980s, Mazur had established himself as one of federal law enforcement's most skilled undercover operatives, capable of inhabiting false identities for months or years without breaking character. His specialty was infiltrating the financial networks that laundered narcotics proceeds, following money trails that led from Miami street corners to Panamanian shell companies to Swiss bank accounts. He had worked smaller cases successfully, but nothing approaching the scale of what his supervisors proposed in late 1985. The Medellin cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, Carlos Leder, and the Ochoa brothers, was generating approximately $60 million per week from cocaine sales in the United States alone. Moving that much cash presented logistical challenges that required sophisticated financial infrastructure and willing banking partners who could transform suitcases of small bills into legitimate-appearing wire transfers and investments. U.S. law enforcement knew the money was being laundered through a complex network of currency exchanges, businesses, and offshore banks. But identifying the key players and gathering prosecutable evidence remained frustratingly difficult. The customs office in Tampa developed an ambitious plan: create a deep cover operation that would position an agent not as someone investigating money laundering, but as someone offering money laundering services, becoming so valuable to the cartel's financial operations that they would expose their entire network while paying him to do it. Mazur volunteered for the assignment, despite understanding the extraordinary risks involved. Unlike narcotics agents who infiltrated trafficking organizations, he would be operating in a space where paranoia and due diligence were standard practice. Financial criminals conducted background checks, verified credentials through multiple sources, and tested new partners with smaller transactions before exposing larger operations. A single inconsistency in his cover story, one document that didn't withstand scrutiny, could mean exposure and execution. Mazur would need a complete false identity backed by verifiable business history, financial credentials that would satisfy suspicious money brokers, and the ability to convince career criminals that he was as corrupt as they were. He spent months working with customs agents to construct the legend of Bob Musella, creating a paper trail that showed a successful but ethically flexible businessman willing to bend rules for wealthy clients who valued discretion above all else. The operational plan required establishing Musella's identity in Tampa's financial community before making any approach toward criminal networks. Mazur rented an upscale apartment, joined exclusive clubs, and began appearing at charity events and business functions where Tampa's elite gathered. He retained a legitimate law firm to handle routine business matters, ensuring that any background check would discover real attorneys willing to confirm Bob Musella as their client. He opened accounts at multiple banks, deposited substantial sums provided by customs through covert channels, and established financial patterns consistent with someone managing significant wealth. The preparation was meticulous and unglamorous, months of building credibility before making any contact with criminal targets. Every detail mattered because career criminals would examine his life from multiple angles, looking for inconsistencies that suggested law enforcement involvement. The breakthrough came through Gonzalo Mora Jr., a Tampa-based drug trafficker whose organization moved large quantities of cocaine and needed reliable methods to launder the proceeds. Mora had been identified through wiretaps and surveillance as someone connected to higher-level Colombian operators, but cautious enough that direct law enforcement pressure had failed to build a prosecutable case. An informant working with customs arranged an introduction, mentioning that Bob Musella was a financial consultant who helped international businessmen with complex transactions and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about source of funds. The initial meeting occurred at a Tampa restaurant in March 1986, deliberately casual but loaded with unspoken vetting. Mora watched Musella carefully, asking seemingly innocent questions designed to probe for inconsistencies or knowledge that a legitimate money launderer wouldn't possess. Mazur had prepared for this interrogation through role-playing sessions with other customs agents, anticipating questions and crafting responses that balanced confidence with appropriate caution. When Mora asked about his background, Musella explained he had worked in banking before establishing his own consulting practice, serving clients who operated internationally and required financial privacy that traditional banks couldn't always provide. He mentioned helping European investors navigate U.S. real estate purchases and assisting South American businessmen establish U.S. corporate entities without triggering excessive regulatory attention. The explanation was deliberately vague, while suggesting exactly the services a money launderer would need, allowing Mora to reach conclusions without Musella explicitly offering criminal services. This was critical operational security. An undercover agent couldn't solicit crimes without risking entrapment defenses, but he could present himself as someone amenable to proposals that criminals initiated. Mora tested Musella with a small transaction first, asking whether he could help deposit $75,000 in cash into U.S. bank accounts without filing the currency transaction reports that federal law required for deposits exceeding $10,000. This was structuring, a federal crime that both men understood carried serious penalties if discovered. Mazur knew that accepting this proposal crossed a legal threshold that required careful documentation to protect the investigation's integrity. He agreed, but specified that his fee would be 5% and that he needed time to arrange the appropriate banking relationships. The response demonstrated professionalism rather than desperation, suggesting someone who provided these services regularly rather than an agent eager to make a case. Over the following 2 weeks, Mazur structured the deposits through multiple banks, using techniques that actual money launderers employed while ensuring that customs secretly documented every transaction. The success of this initial operation established Musella's credibility and opened access to Mora's broader network. Within weeks, Mora introduced him to other traffickers who needed similar services, each transaction larger than the last. Mazur found himself handling hundreds of thousands of dollars monthly, meeting with criminals who discussed cocaine shipments and distribution networks with casual directness. Each meeting was recorded through hidden microphones that Mazur wore, tiny devices concealed in briefcases, or watches that captured conversations while he maintained his cover flawlessly. The psychological strain was immense, requiring constant vigilance to avoid any verbal slip or behavioral inconsistency that might trigger suspicion. He couldn't drink alcohol despite social pressure to do so, fearing that impairment might cause him to break character. He invented a medical condition to explain his abstinence, another detail added to the complex web of deception. The operation expanded beyond Mazur's initial expectations when Mora introduced him to representatives of Colombian cartels seeking to move even larger sums. These weren't street-level dealers, but financial operatives who managed the cartel's international money flows, sophisticated criminals who understood banking regulations and international finance. They needed someone who could not only structure cash deposits, but also wire funds internationally, create shell companies to obscure ownership, and invest drug proceeds in legitimate businesses that would generate clean income. Mazur recognized that he was being offered access to the very infrastructure that made the cocaine trade financially viable, an opportunity that could justify all the risks and effort invested in building his cover. He accepted the expanded role while insisting on meeting the higher-level decision-makers, explaining that moving millions required trust and direct relationships rather than working through intermediaries. This demand led to introduction to Emir Abreu, who would become Mazur's partner in the operation's next phase. Abreu was actually another undercover customs agent, Cuban-American, fluent in Spanish, capable of navigating Latin American business culture with natural ease. In the cover story presented to criminals, Abreu was Musella's business partner who handled Caribbean and Latin American operations, while Musella managed U.S. banking relationships. The partnership allowed them to support each other's cover stories, present a more substantial operation to potential clients, and provide mutual security in meetings where a lone undercover agent might be vulnerable. Together, they began meeting with cartel financial operatives in Miami, Panama City, and eventually Colombia itself, traveling into the heart of criminal territory with only their cover identities and the customs backup teams monitoring from distances that might prove too far if situations turned violent. The stakes escalated dramatically when they were introduced to officials from the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, a multinational financial institution that operated in 73 countries and held assets exceeding $20 billion. BCCI presented itself as a legitimate international bank serving clients worldwide, but Mazur quickly recognized that significant portions of its operations existed specifically to facilitate money laundering for drug traffickers, arms dealers, and corrupt political figures. Bank officers didn't merely accept suspicious deposits. They actively marketed money laundering services, offering to structure transactions to avoid regulatory reporting, establishing shell corporations in jurisdictions that protected ownership secrecy, and creating complex financial instruments designed specifically to obscure the criminal origins of deposited funds. The bank's Panama and Colombian branches operated as full-service money laundering facilities, and its officers discussed these services with the casual professionalism of legitimate bankers offering checking accounts. Mazur realized that BCCI represented a far larger target than the individual traffickers he'd been cultivating. Taking down this bank would disrupt money laundering for criminal organizations worldwide, striking at financial infrastructure that enabled not just drug trafficking, but international terrorism and weapons proliferation. He redirected the investigation's focus while maintaining his relationships with cartel operatives, positioning himself as someone whose banking contacts could handle unlimited volumes at fees lower than competitors charged. This positioning attracted attention from higher-level cartel financial managers, including representatives connected directly to Pablo Escobar's organization. By summer 1986, less than 6 months after the operation began, Mazur was handling transactions exceeding $1 million weekly and meeting with criminals who discussed finances for some of the world's most violent drug trafficking organizations. The operation required expanding beyond Mazur and Abreu to include additional undercover agents in supporting roles. Kathy Ertz, an IRS criminal investigator, was brought in to pose as Musela's fiancée, adding domestic credibility to his cover and providing a female perspective that sometimes disarmed the macho criminals who dominated the trafficking world. The decision to present them as engaged rather than married created social obligations that deepened their cover, as criminal associates expected to meet wives and girlfriends at social functions, creating relationships that extended beyond purely business interactions. Kathy and Robert attended dinners at the homes of traffickers, celebrated birthdays and holidays with people they were secretly working to imprison, and maintained an entirely fictional romantic relationship that felt disturbingly real during the months they lived it. The psychological complexity of befriending people while building cases against them created moral weight that all undercover agents carried, but rarely discussed. If you're still watching this moment, when a federal agent walked into the Dragon's Den with nothing but a false name and a wire, if you believe some operations demand risking everything to dismantle evil at its financial roots, go ahead and like this video and comment the word infiltrate below. Let's see how many of us understand that the most dangerous battles aren't always fought with guns. The operation scope expanded further when BCCI officers introduced Mazur to their private banking division, which catered to ultra-wealthy clients requiring absolute discretion. These weren't commercial accounts, but private relationships managed by senior bank officers who traveled internationally to meet clients personally. The officer assigned to handle Musela's accounts was Amjad Awan, a Pakistani national working from BCCI's Paris office, who presented himself as capable of handling any financial requirement regardless of legality. Awan explained that BCCI could receive cash deposits in multiple countries simultaneously, wire funds through layers of correspondent banks that obscured the transaction trail, and establish offshore corporations that provided legitimate appearing ownership for assets purchased with drug money. He discussed these services in detailed technical terms, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of international banking regulations and the methods for circumventing them. Mazur recorded these conversations, documenting not just individual crimes, but systematic institutional corruption. Awan introduced him to other BCCI officers, each meeting captured on hidden recording devices that Mazur wore despite knowing that discovery would likely mean execution. The physical danger was constant and immediate. These were people who had murdered competitors, tortured informants and eliminated anyone who threatened their operations. Mazur maintained his cover through psychological techniques he had developed over years of undercover work, inhabiting the character so completely that Bob Musella's mannerisms, speech patterns, and attitudes became automatic responses rather than conscious performance. He trained himself to think as Musella would think, react as Musella would react, so that even under stress or surprise, his responses remained consistent with his cover identity. The challenge intensified when cartel operatives demanded to meet Musella's banking contacts directly, wanting to establish relationships that didn't depend entirely on his intermediation. This presented operational complications because federal agents couldn't simply produce corrupt bankers on demand. The solution came through BCCI officers themselves, who were sufficiently confident in the bank's impunity that they agreed to meet directly with known drug traffickers to discuss money laundering services. These meetings occurred in luxury hotels in Miami and Tampa, recorded by custom surveillance teams using hidden cameras and microphones while Mazur sat in the room maintaining his cover. The recordings captured bank officers explaining to cartel financial managers exactly how BCCI would structure transactions to evade U.S. law enforcement detection, providing evidence of institutional money laundering conspiracy that would later prove devastating in court. By late 1986, Mazur was operating simultaneously in multiple criminal circles: trafficking organizations that needed cash laundered, corrupt bankers who provided laundering services, and financial professionals who created shell companies and false documentation to support the schemes. Each circle intersected with others in ways that revealed the broader architecture of international money laundering. He discovered that the same BCCI officers serving cartel clients also handled accounts for Middle Eastern arms dealers and corrupt political figures, demonstrating that the bank operated as a criminal financial institution serving multiple illegal enterprises. The scope was staggering, suggesting that bringing down BCCI would impact criminal operations far beyond cocaine trafficking. Mazur and his handlers at customs recognized they were building a case unprecedented in scale and complexity. The operational security challenges became increasingly acute as the investigation expanded. More people meant more opportunities for security breaches, more chances that someone would recognize an undercover agent or notice inconsistencies in cover stories. Mazur lived in constant awareness that criminals were conducting their own investigations, running his name through contacts in banking and law enforcement, looking for evidence that Bob Musella wasn't who he claimed to be. Customs had seeded his background so thoroughly that these investigations found confirming evidence, legitimate businesses, and banking relationships that supported his cover, but the scrutiny never ceased entirely. Every new criminal contact brought fresh vetting, new questions that had to be answered consistently with everything he'd said previously. Maintaining a perfect memory of his own lies became a survival skill. The deepest penetration of cartel operations came when Mora arranged for Musella to meet directly with representatives of Pablo Escobar's financial network. The meeting occurred in Panama in early 1987, at a luxury hotel where cartel operatives gathered to discuss their operations with a freedom impossible in the United States. Mazur flew to Panama wearing hidden recording devices, knowing that customs backup teams would be unable to intervene quickly if his cover failed in a foreign country where the cartel had virtually unlimited power. The meeting felt surreal, sitting across from men who managed finances for an organization responsible for thousands of deaths, discussing money transfers and banking arrangements while servants poured coffee and armed bodyguards waited in the hallway. The cartel representatives treated banking with the same professional detachment that legitimate businessmen brought to corporate finance, reviewing spreadsheets and discussing interest rates while casually mentioning cocaine shipments measured in tons. During this Panama meeting, Mazur was introduced to the concept that would ultimately provide the operation's climactic moment, a wedding. The cartel operatives mentioned that they preferred doing business with people they knew socially, not just professionally, building relationships through family connections and celebrations that created bonds of trust and mutual obligation. One operative mentioned that he'd attended his money manager's wedding the previous year, meeting other business associates there, strengthening relationships in a relaxed environment where real connections formed beyond transactional interactions. The comment planted an idea that Mazur would later develop into an operational masterstroke, a way to gather all his targets simultaneously in one location where they could be arrested together, preventing them from fleeing or destroying evidence when they learned the investigation had been compromised. Back in Tampa, Mazur proposed the wedding plan to his customs supervisors. He would announce his engagement to Kathy Ertz, whom criminals had met as his fiancée, and invite all the traffickers and corrupt bankers he'd been cultivating to an engagement party and eventually a wedding celebration. The event would provide plausible reason for gathering people who didn't all know each other, since weddings naturally brought together the groom's diverse business and personal contacts. At a predetermined moment during the celebration, arrest teams would move in simultaneously, taking everyone into custody before they could flee or communicate warnings to associates. The plan was audacious and risky, with dozens of variables that could go catastrophically wrong. But it offered the possibility of concluding the investigation with maximum impact and minimal warning that might allow targets to escape. The months leading to the operation's conclusion required Mazur to deepen his criminal relationships while secretly coordinating with prosecutors to prepare indictments. He continued laundering money, each transaction documented and preserved as evidence, building financial trails that connected individual criminals to specific illegal acts. The recordings he'd made during hundreds of meetings were transcribed and organized, creating a documentary record of conspiracy that would be difficult for defense attorneys to dispute. Federal prosecutors in Tampa worked with customs agents to identify which targets had committed crimes within their jurisdiction, building cases that would survive legal challenges and result in substantial prison sentences. The scope had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations, with over 80 targets identified for potential prosecution. As the investigation progressed through 1987 and into 1988, Mazur dealt with the psychological toll of living a double life for more than 2 years. He maintained minimal contact with his actual family to protect their safety and preserve his cover, celebrating holidays and birthdays apart from the wife and children who represented his real life. The isolation was profound, spending virtually all his time with either criminals who would kill him if they discovered his true identity, or fellow agents who couldn't fully understand the unique stress of deep undercover work. He attended counseling sessions with agency psychologists when possible, discussing the moral complexity of befriending people he was working to imprison, and the constant fear that a single mistake would result in his death. The psychological preparation for undercover work included training in compartmentalization, separating the cover identity from the real self, but maintaining that separation for years tested limits that training could only partially address. The final phase of the operation began in early 1988 when Mazur announced to his criminal associates that he and Kathy would be getting married. The news was met with enthusiasm and congratulations, with several traffickers and bankers offering to help arrange celebrations or suggesting destinations for the honeymoon. Mazur explained that they planned an engagement party at the Innisbrook Resort near Tampa, inviting their closest friends and business associates for an evening of celebration before the wedding itself. The guest list would include everyone who had been integral to their business success, he explained, the people who had made the past 2 years so profitable and whom he and Kathy wanted to thank personally. The invitation was impossible to refuse without causing offense, and virtually every target accepted, pleased to be included in the inner circle of someone they believed to be a valuable criminal associate. The Innisbrook Resort was selected deliberately for operational advantages it offered law enforcement. The venue was somewhat isolated, making it difficult for targets to flee quickly if they became suspicious. Its layout included areas where arrest teams could stage without being visible to arriving guests, and its management cooperated with customs after being briefed on the operation's law enforcement purpose, allowing agents to position themselves throughout the facility disguised as hotel staff. In the weeks before the event, customs agents posing as wedding planners surveyed every room, hallway, and exit, planning precisely how arrests would unfold to minimize risk of violence or escape. The operation required coordination among multiple federal agencies, with over 200 agents positioned to make simultaneous arrests of targets attending the party and others identified as co-conspirators who would be taken into custody at different locations. The engagement party was scheduled for October 8, 1988. In the final days before, Mazur experienced profound anxiety about the countless variables that could derail the plan. A target might become suspicious and warn others not to attend. Someone might recognize an undercover agent from a previous case. A criminal associate not invited might call one of the targets during the party and mention something that revealed the operation. The possibilities for disaster multiplied in Mazur's mind during sleepless nights when the weight of 2.5 years of deception felt crushing. He had lived as Bob Musella longer than some people maintained actual relationships, building a fictional life more detailed than many people's real ones. The prospect of it ending, either in successful arrests or catastrophic exposure, created anticipatory stress that was nearly unbearable. The evening of October 8th arrived with Tampa's humid warmth settling over the Innisbrook Resort as luxury cars began arriving. Traffickers and money launderers emerged in expensive suits and designer dresses, greeting each other with embraces and laughter, celebrating what they believed was a happy personal milestone for a valued criminal associate. Amjad Awan flew in from Paris, bringing a gift of crystal champagne flutes. Gonzalo Mora arrived with his wife, congratulating Musella on finding happiness and joking about marriage's challenges. Other targets mingled in the resort's elegant ballroom, drinking champagne and discussing business opportunities in the casual manner of criminals who believed themselves safely among allies. None of them noticed the hotel staff who moved through the crowd with unusual attention, or recognized that some of the servers and musicians were actually federal agents positioning themselves for the arrest signal. Mazur circulated through the party with Kathy beside him, maintaining his cover even as internal tension approached unbearable levels. He made small talk with people he'd been recording for months, accepting congratulations while watching for the signal that would indicate arrest teams were ready to move. The plan called for waiting until most targets had arrived and gathered in the ballroom, maximizing the number arrested simultaneously while minimizing opportunities for escape. The timing had to be precise, late enough that departing early would seem suspicious, but not so late that guests might start leaving on their own. Mazur had lived with danger for years, but this moment concentrated all the accumulated risk into a single explosive event where success or catastrophic failure would be determined within minutes. At exactly 9:37 p.m., Mazur received the signal. He and Kathy moved toward the ballroom's exit as arrest teams emerged from their concealed positions. The transformation was sudden and overwhelming, hotel staff revealing themselves as federal agents, weapons drawn, command shouting through the space that moments before had echoed with celebration and laughter. Targets froze in confusion and shock, the scene too surreal to immediately comprehend. Some reached for weapons they'd concealed despite the party's social nature, but found themselves surrounded before they could draw them. Others attempted to flee, running toward exits only to discover more agents blocking every escape route. Within 4 minutes, every target in the ballroom was in custody, hands secured behind their backs, Miranda rights being read in English and Spanish. The arrests at Innisbrook occurred simultaneously with raids at other locations where co-conspirators had been identified. In Miami, Los Angeles, New York, and internationally in Panama and Europe, law enforcement teams executed arrest warrants on the same schedule, taking more than 80 people into custody before word could spread that the operation had been compromised. BCCI offices were raided in multiple countries, with agents seizing files and computer records that documented the bank's institutional money laundering conspiracy. The coordination was unprecedented in scale, representing months of planning to ensure that the investigation's conclusion didn't allow targets to flee or destroy evidence. Within hours, news of the takedown was spreading through law enforcement and criminal networks simultaneously, shocking both communities with its scope. For Maza, the moment of arrest brought complex emotions rather than simple relief. He watched people he'd known for years being taken into custody, some shouting in confusion, others silent in shock, a few looking directly at him with expressions of betrayed recognition as they understood what he actually was. These were violent criminals, responsible for immense suffering, he reminded himself, people who had chosen to profit from addiction and death. Yet he had shared meals with their families, attended their children's birthday parties, and built relationships that contained elements of genuine human connection despite their foundation in deception. The moral complexity of deep undercover work crystallized in that moment. The understanding that fighting monsters sometimes required becoming convincingly monstrous, that justice sometimes demanded deception, and that righteousness didn't eliminate the psychological cost of what had been necessary. The aftermath unfolded over the following months as prosecutors built cases against the 85 people indicted in what became known as Operation Sea Chase. The evidence Maza and other undercover agents had gathered was overwhelming. Hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, thousands of pages of financial documents, testimony from cooperating witnesses who chose to testify rather than face decades in prison. Defense attorneys challenged the investigation's methods, arguing that undercover agents had entrapped clients into criminal activity, but the recordings demonstrated clearly that targets had initiated illegal proposals and that agents had merely agreed to participate. The legal proceedings revealed the full scope of BCCI's institutional corruption, exposing the bank's role in laundering money not just for drug cartels, but for arms dealers, terrorist organizations, and corrupt political figures worldwide. BCCI attempted to minimize the damage, claiming that rogue employees, rather than institutional policy, had provided illegal services. But the documentary evidence proved that money laundering was central to the bank's business model. International regulators began investigating BCCI's operations in their jurisdictions, discovering similar patterns of corruption and criminal facilitation. In 1991, 3 years after Operation Sea Chase's arrests, regulators in multiple countries simultaneously seized BCCI's assets and shut down its operations worldwide, liquidating what had been one of the world's largest banks. The collapse represented unprecedented regulatory action against a major financial institution and sent a message to other banks that facilitating money laundering carried existential risks. The criminal prosecutions resulting from Operation Sea Chase produced significant convictions. Gonzalo Mora received a lengthy federal prison sentence for drug trafficking and money laundering conspiracy. Amjad Awan was convicted of money laundering and served prison time before being deported. Dozens of other traffickers and corrupt bankers pleaded guilty or were convicted at trial, receiving sentences ranging from several years to life imprisonment. The operation didn't destroy the Medellin cartel, which continued operating until Pablo Escobar's death in 1993, but it significantly disrupted the cartel's financial operations and demonstrated that U.S. law enforcement could penetrate even the most sophisticated criminal financial networks. For Robert Mazur, the operation's conclusion meant emerging from the Bob Musella identity after more than 2 years of living as someone else. The transition was psychologically challenging, requiring counseling and time to reintegrate into his actual life and reconnect with the family he'd been separated from during the undercover assignment. He continued working for customs in other capacities, but never again conducted deep undercover operations of similar duration and intensity. The experience had demonstrated both the effectiveness of such operations and their profound personal cost, raising questions about how much could reasonably be asked of agents willing to sacrifice years of normal life to infiltrate criminal organizations. The techniques developed during Operation Sea Chase influenced law enforcement approaches to financial crimes for decades afterward. The operation demonstrated that attacking criminal organizations' financial infrastructure was as important as interdicting drugs or arresting traffickers, that money laundering prosecutions could produce longer sentences and more significant operational disruption than traditional narcotics cases. It showed that banks and financial professionals who facilitated criminal activity could be held criminally responsible rather than merely fined, establishing precedents that prosecutors would use in subsequent cases against financial institutions involved in money laundering. And it proved that patient, methodical undercover operations could penetrate criminal networks that seemed impenetrable to traditional investigative methods. The broader impact extended to international banking regulation and anti-money laundering enforcement. The BCCI scandal exposed how international banks could exploit gaps between different countries' regulatory systems, operating legally in some jurisdictions while facilitating crimes in others. This recognition led to enhanced international cooperation in banking oversight and the development of unified standards for detecting and preventing money laundering. The Financial Action Task Force, an international body established in 1989 to combat money laundering, cited the BCCI case as evidence of the need for coordinated global approaches to financial crime. Banks worldwide implemented more rigorous know your customer procedures and suspicious activity reporting requirements, raising the costs and difficulty of large-scale money laundering. Yet despite these advances, money laundering remains a persistent challenge for law enforcement. Criminal organizations have adapted to enhanced scrutiny, developing new techniques that exploit emerging technologies and financial instruments. The rise of cryptocurrency and digital payment systems has created new opportunities for obscuring the origins of criminal proceeds. And the globalization of finance means that money can move across borders nearly instantaneously, faster than law enforcement can coordinate international investigations. The cat-and-mouse game between criminals seeking to launder proceeds and authorities attempting to detect and prevent it continues, with each side adapting to the other's innovations. Mazur's story illustrates the human dimension of this ongoing struggle. Behind the statistics about drug trafficking volumes and money laundering amounts are individuals who make choices, sometimes heroic and sometimes destructive, that shape the broader conflict between criminal enterprises and the society attempting to defend itself against them. An undercover agent who spends years living a lie to infiltrate a cartel's financial operations. A banker who rationalizes facilitating money laundering as merely providing services to clients. A trafficker who views drug proceeds as legitimate business income requiring professional financial management. Each person's choices create the complex ecosystem in which these battles unfold. The psychological cost Mazur paid for his undercover work remains difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. He spent more than 2 years unable to be fully himself, living in constant fear of exposure, maintaining relationships based entirely on deception, and experiencing the isolation inherent in deep cover operations. The stress contributed to health problems and strained his marriage, despite his wife's understanding of the operation's importance. Other agents involved in Operation Sea Chase reported similar struggles, some leaving law enforcement entirely after the operation concluded because the psychological toll proved too high to sustain across a career. These hidden costs rarely appear in official accounts of successful operations, but represent real sacrifices made by individuals willing to endure them in pursuit of justice. The operation also raised ethical questions about the methods law enforcement employs against criminal organizations. Undercover agents necessarily engage in illegal activity while building their covers, laundering money and facilitating transactions that harm innocent people who become addicted to the drugs those proceeds represent. The legal framework governing such operations attempts to balance the need for effective investigative techniques against the danger that law enforcement itself becomes corrupted by too closely resembling the criminals it pursues. Critics argue that some undercover operations cross ethical lines, that agents who spend years pretending to be criminals risk losing sight of the boundaries that should separate them from their targets. Defenders respond that fighting sophisticated criminal organizations requires accepting moral complexity, that some ethical discomfort is the price of effectively defending society against groups that recognize no ethical constraints. These debates continued long after Operation Sea Chase concluded, informing discussions about law enforcement methods and appropriate limits on government power. The operation demonstrated both the potential and the risks of deep undercover work, showing what could be accomplished while raising questions about what should be attempted. Subsequent operations adopted similar techniques with varying success, some producing significant cases, while others ended in failure or tragedy when agents' covers were compromised. the legacy remains mixed, celebrated by those who emphasize the operation's success in disrupting criminal networks, while questioned by those troubled by its methods and costs. 35 years after the Innisbrook arrests, the story retains relevance as law enforcement continues confronting transnational criminal organizations whose financial sophistication matches or exceeds that of legitimate businesses. The fundamental challenge remains unchanged: how to attack organizations that operate across borders, exploit regulatory gaps between jurisdictions, and employ professionals with expertise in finance, law, and technology to protect their operations. The solutions require similar combinations of patience, courage, and willingness to take calculated risks that characterized Operation Sea Chase, along with international cooperation that has improved since the 1980s, but remains imperfect. Robert Mazza eventually left federal law enforcement and established a consulting firm that helps banks and corporations develop anti-money laundering programs and comply with regulatory requirements. He wrote a memoir, The Infiltrator, detailing his experiences during Operation Sea Chase, which was later adapted into a feature film starring Bryan Cranston. In interviews and speeches, he emphasizes both the importance of financial investigations in combating criminal organizations and the profound personal costs such operations exact from the agents who conduct them. He speaks about the psychological challenges of deep undercover work with unusual candor, describing the isolation, fear, and moral complexity that characterized his years as Bob Musella. The people he helped imprison serve as reminders of the human consequences of both criminal activity and its prosecution. Some died in prison, their lives ending in confinement, far from the wealth and power they'd once enjoyed. Others were eventually released, deported to their home countries, where some returned to criminal activity while others attempted to build legitimate lives. A few cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony that led to additional cases, their decisions to betray former associates motivated by self-preservation rather than moral awakening. Each person's story unfolded differently, but all were shaped by their intersection with an undercover agent whose dedication to his mission exceeded their ability to detect his deception. The banks and financial professionals who facilitated money laundering faced consequences that sent ripples through the international banking industry. BCCI's collapse destroyed the savings of hundreds of thousands of depositors who had used the bank for legitimate purposes, unaware of its criminal activities. The bank's failure demonstrated that institutions engaged in systematic criminal facilitation risk complete destruction rather than merely fines and sanctions. Other banks operating in similar gray areas took note, some cleaning up their practices, while others simply became more careful about concealing illegal activities. The regulatory environment tightened significantly, making large-scale money laundering more difficult, but far from impossible. The story reminds us that major criminal organizations don't exist in isolation, but depend on complex ecosystems of supporting services and professionals. Drug cartels need chemists to process cocaine, smugglers to transport it, distributors to sell it, and financial professionals to launder the proceeds. Disrupting any component of this ecosystem creates operational challenges that cascade throughout the organization. Law enforcement strategies have increasingly recognized this reality, targeting not just the violent traffickers, but the lawyers, bankers, accountants, and logistics professionals whose expertise makes large-scale trafficking possible. Operation Sea Chase was among the first major investigations to demonstrate this approach's effectiveness. Yet the operation's success also revealed limitations in law enforcement's ability to fundamentally change the underlying dynamics that make drug trafficking profitable. Despite the arrests and convictions, cocaine continued flowing into the United States throughout the 1990s and beyond. Other cartels emerged to replace Medellin when it finally collapsed. Other banks, perhaps more careful about avoiding detection, stepped in to provide the financial services BCCI had offered. The demand for illegal drugs persisted, creating profit opportunities that attracted new criminal entrepreneurs despite the risks. This reality suggests that law enforcement operations, however skillfully executed, address symptoms rather than causes of the drug trade. The broader policy questions raised by this recognition continue to generate debate. Some argue that since prohibition creates the profit margins that make trafficking attractive despite its risks, legalization or decriminalization might be more effective than enforcement at reducing the harms associated with drug markets. Others maintain that aggressive law enforcement, while imperfect, is necessary to contain problems that would expand dramatically without it. The arguments involve empirical questions about what approaches actually reduce drug use and its associated harms, along with moral and philosophical questions about state power, individual liberty, and social obligation. Operation Sea Chase doesn't resolve these debates, but illustrates the human courage and sacrifice involved in enforcement approaches, whatever their ultimate effectiveness. What remains undebatable is the extraordinary dedication Robert Mazur and his colleagues brought to an operation that demanded years of their lives and psychological costs that would persist long after its conclusion. They volunteered for assignments that required constant fear, extended separation from family, and the knowledge that discovery would likely mean death. They made these sacrifices believing that disrupting criminal organizations' financial operations would reduce the suffering caused by drug trafficking, and that the rule of law required holding accountable even the most powerful and violent criminals. Whether their sacrifices achieved all they hoped, they deserve recognition for the courage required to make them. Standing in the wreckage of celebration at the Innisbrook Resort on that October evening in 1988, watching people he'd known for years being taken into custody while his true identity was finally revealed, Robert Mazur experienced the complicated satisfaction of completed mission mixed with exhaustion and moral complexity. He had succeeded beyond what seemed possible when the operation began, penetrating the Medellin cartel's financial operations and exposing institutional corruption at one of the world's largest banks. The success came at significant personal cost and raised questions about methods and ethics that have no simple answers. But in that moment, watching the culmination of 2.5 years of deception and danger, what Mazur felt most acutely was relief that he had survived, that he could finally stop being Bob Musella, and that the risks he'd accepted had produced results that justified, at least in his own mind, everything he'd endured to achieve them.